A nervous waiter accidentally spilled a drink on a wealthy woman at a restaurant. What she did next changed his life forever. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional pop of champagne glasses created a symphony of opulence at La Seraphine, the city's most exclusive restaurant. Beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, the tables were set with precision. Linen napkins folded into swans, cutlery gleaming like polished mirrors, and wine glasses sparkling under the ambient light. For most, this was a sanctuary of indulgence. But for Jake, the young waiter rushing between tables, it was a minefield of potential disaster. Jake wasn't just nervous, he was petrified. Tonight, of all nights, the stakes felt impossibly high. It wasn't just the ritzy crowd or the VIP reservation list that included names Jake had only ever read about in tabloids. No, it was the simple, gut-wrenching fear of failure, one he knew intimately after years of scraping by, always teetering on the edge of making it or breaking it. The tray in his hands wobbled slightly as he balanced 2 glasses of Merlot and a cocktail garnished with an elaborate orange peel twist. His palms were sweaty, and his bow tie felt like a noose around his neck. He muttered to himself under his breath, a mantra of steady, steady, but the moment he passed table 7, where a group of socialites were mid-laugh, his heart skipped a beat. One of the women turned, her designer clutch knocking against his elbow. The tray jerked, and a slosh of red wine threatened to spill. "Careful," barked Mr. Grayson, the maitre d', his sharp eyes catching Jake's near stumble from across the room. Dressed immaculately in a charcoal suit, Mr. Grayson was the kind of boss who didn't tolerate anything less than perfection. Jake's stomach tightened, and he gave a quick, apologetic nod. The problem wasn't just the pressure. It was Jake himself. He wasn't cut out for this world of refinement and polish. Born and raised on the other side of the tracks, he had taken the job at La Seraphine not because it suited him, but because it paid enough to help his mom cover rent and buy groceries. His co-workers, with their easy grace and polished manners, seemed like they belonged here. Jake felt like a stray cat that had wandered into a 5-star hotel. By the time he reached table 9, where a single, elegant woman sat reading the wine menu, Jake was drenched in self-consciousness. She was striking, with auburn hair swept into a loose chignon and a string of pearls resting casually on her collarbone. Everything about her screamed wealth, from the designer dress she wore effortlessly to the way she glanced at Jake, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Good evening, ma'am," Jake managed, his voice cracking slightly. "Your drink." He set the cocktail down carefully, relieved when it didn't wobble. The woman smiled faintly, a mere flicker of acknowledgement, and returned her attention to the menu. Jake lingered a second too long, his nerves fraying as he tried to recall if he'd forgotten anything. Water? Utensils? He started to step back, but at that moment, her hand shifted, brushing against the drink. Time seemed to slow. Jake's eyes widened as the glass tipped, the amber liquid spilling across the pristine tablecloth and soaking into her lap. "Oh no," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. The laughter at table 7 quieted. Mr. Grayson, who had been speaking to a guest by the bar, turned toward Jake with an expression that could curdle milk. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed a napkin, fumbling as he tried to blot the spill, his hands shaking. "I am so sorry," Jake stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Let me clean that up." The woman looked down at her ruined dress, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she raised her gaze to Jake. Her face was calm, too calm. Jake braced himself for the inevitable reprimand, the cutting words he was sure would follow. After all, people like her didn't just let things like this slide. They had standards, and Jake had just trampled all over them. Instead, she did something Jake never expected. She laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, nor was it cruel. It was soft, almost musical, and filled with something Jake couldn't quite place. Amusement, maybe, or a strange sense of understanding. "It's just a dress," she said, her voice warm, with an accent Jake couldn't quite place. She took the napkin from his trembling hands and began to dab at the tablecloth herself. "You act like you've spilled liquid gold." Jake blinked, stunned into silence. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Relax," she said, her tone light. "No harm done. Though, I imagine Mr. Grayson isn't going to let you off so easily." Jake glanced toward the maitre d', whose face was a thundercloud. He felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'll fix it," Jake said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. I'll get a new tablecloth, and I'll pay for the cleaning." The woman tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made Jake squirm. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. "Jake," he said, swallowing hard. "Jake Miller." "Well, Jake Miller," she said, her lips curving into a small smile. "Take a deep breath. Accidents happen." Her calm demeanor was baffling. Jake had spilled a drink on her expensive dress in the middle of the city's most prestigious restaurant, and yet she was treating him like he'd merely scuffed her shoe. He didn't know what to make of it. As Jake rushed off to fetch a fresh tablecloth and clean the spill, he couldn't shake the woman's image from his mind. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put into words. Her laughter lingered in his ears, a sound that somehow cut through his panic and left a strange calm in its wake. By the time he returned, Mr. Grayson had arrived at the table, apologizing profusely to the woman. Jake kept his head down as he worked, bracing for the reprimand that he knew would come later. But as he swapped the tablecloth, the woman caught his eye and gave him a quick, reassuring nod. Jake didn't know it yet, but that single moment of kindness, that small act of grace in the face of his blunder, would set into motion a series of events that would change his life forever. The air in La Seraphine seemed heavier now, thick with whispers and sidelong glances. Jake Miller, still shaken from his earlier mishap, felt every pair of eyes boring into him as he worked to replace the tablecloth at the wealthy woman's table. His hands moved with practiced speed, but his mind raced, replaying the moment the drink had tipped and soaked her pristine dress. The sound of her laugh still lingered in his ears, a sound that didn't match the chaos of the moment or the expectations of someone like her. At the bar, Mr. Grayson was watching like a hawk, his stern expression promising consequences. Jake felt a wave of dread. He'd been warned before about his nervous tendencies. The restaurant didn't have time for clumsiness, Mr. Grayson had said during Jake's first week. But now, clumsiness had landed Jake squarely in the spotlight, and it wasn't the flattering kind. "Jake," Mr. Grayson called sharply, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. The maitre d' approached with the kind of precision Jake envied. Every step measured, every word deliberate. "The kitchen needs you. Now." Jake opened his mouth to protest. There was still cleanup to do. But the woman at the table interjected. "He's fine here," she said with a casual wave of her hand. Her tone was calm, but her presence demanded attention. Even Mr. Grayson, who rarely acknowledged anyone but the most elite clientele, faltered for a moment. "Ma'am, I assure you, we'll have someone else. It's not necessary," she said, her gaze cutting through the room with the ease of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Jake's doing a fine job." Jake froze. No one ever spoke up for him like that, especially not in a place like this. Mr. Grayson, visibly taken aback, gave a curt nod before retreating, though his narrowed eyes promised Jake they weren't done. The restaurant's usual hum resumed, but Jake could still feel the tension in the air. He glanced at the woman, unsure whether to thank her or apologize again. "I'm sorry," he said instead, his voice barely audible. The woman looked up from her now refreshed table, a faint smile playing on her lips. "For what?" she asked, genuinely curious. "For the mess," Jake stammered. "For interrupting your evening." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "Mess? My dear, if this is what you consider a mess, then you've clearly never been to one of my family's gatherings. Believe me, this is tame." Her response caught Jake off guard, drawing a small, nervous chuckle from him despite himself. There was something disarming about her, a warmth he hadn't expected from someone so evidently wealthy. It wasn't just her clothes or her composure. It was the way she carried herself, with an air of elegance that didn't feel overbearing. "Do you always apologize this much?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake hesitated. "I guess I just don't want to make things worse." She leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "Well, Jake Miller, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. It's how you handle the worst that counts." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. He busied himself collecting the used napkins and glasses, trying not to dwell on her words. But they stuck with him, lingering in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. As he carried the tray back toward the kitchen, the whispers followed him. He caught snippets. "Clumsy kid. Lucky she didn't make a scene. Grayson's furious." Jake ducked his head, willing himself to focus on the tasks ahead. He had to finish this shift, no matter what. Inside the kitchen, the usual clatter of pots and pans was a welcome distraction. The head chef barked orders while the sous chefs scrambled to keep up. Jake placed the tray by the dishwasher and wiped his brow. He could still feel the tension from the dining room, but at least back here, the stakes felt less personal. "You all right, kid?" one of the line cooks asked, sliding a plate of seared scallops onto a tray. Jake nodded quickly. "Yeah, just rough night." "Grayson chewing you out again?" the cook asked with a sympathetic smirk. "Not yet," Jake said grimly, knowing it was only a matter of time. Back on the floor, Jake resumed his duties, moving cautiously between tables. He avoided looking directly at the woman's table, afraid he might spill something else if he did. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw her occasionally glancing his way, her expression unreadable. By the end of the night, the restaurant was winding down. Jake found himself clearing the last few tables, his energy drained but his nerves still buzzing. When he approached the wealthy woman's table to collect her bill, she surprised him by standing just as he arrived. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her tone softer now. Jake blinked, confused. "For what?" "For not letting that little incident ruin my evening," she said. "You handled it well." "Well?" Jake repeated, incredulous. "I thought I nearly got fired." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But I've seen worse reactions to a little spilled drink." Jake didn't know how to respond. He watched as she reached into her handbag, pulling out an elegantly embossed business card. She held it out to him, and he took it hesitantly. "If you're ever looking for something different," she said, her gaze steady, "give me a call." Jake stared at the card, the gold lettering shimmering under the dim light. It simply read, "Eleanor Prescott, Prescott Foundation." "I don't understand," he said, looking up at her. "You will," Eleanor said with a small, knowing smile. "Take care of yourself, Jake." And with that, she left, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she disappeared through the restaurant's grand doors. Jake stood there for a moment, the card still in his hand, unsure of what to think. His head swam with questions. Why had she given him her card? What was the Prescott Foundation? And why did she care about someone like him? As the restaurant staff began to pack up for the night, Jake slipped the card into his pocket, resolving to look into it later. For now, he had to focus on surviving the inevitable lecture from Mr. Grayson. But as he mopped the floor and stacked chairs, Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. Jake didn't know it yet, but his life had just taken a turn, and it all started with a spilled drink. The Prescott Foundation card sat on Jake's nightstand, catching the faint morning light that slipped through the crack in his curtains. He had picked it up at least 5 times since stumbling home from his shift, each time setting it back down, unsure what to make of it. The name, Eleanor Prescott, felt heavy with mystery. Who was she? What did she want? And why on earth would someone like her hand him a nobody from the wrong side of town a business card? Jake groaned, rubbing his temples as he sat up. His tiny studio apartment was a far cry from the luxury of La Seraphine. The peeling wallpaper and creaky bed frame served as a daily reminder of the gap between his life and the world of diners like Eleanor. The faint hum of traffic below his window mixed with the occasional shout from the street, a sharp contrast to the hushed elegance of the restaurant. This was his reality, and it didn't involve mysterious, wealthy women with cryptic offers. But the card stayed in his pocket as he headed out, tucked safely beside the crumpled bills from last night's tips. By the time Jake clocked in for his next shift, the fallout from his spill had already spread. Word had made its way around the staff, and whispers trailed him wherever he went. A couple of the servers offered sympathetic glances, but most just shook their heads as he passed. Mr. Grayson, however, remained silent. His silence, Jake knew, was worse than any reprimand. The evening unfolded with its usual symphony of orders, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. Jake moved cautiously, hyper-aware of every step, every tray he carried. He kept his head down, avoiding Mr. Grayson's piercing gaze and trying not to think about the card in his pocket. But as the night wore on, the weight of Eleanor's offer began to gnaw at him. When the rush finally subsided, Jake found himself lingering by the staff locker room, pulling the card out of his pocket once more. He traced the embossed letters with his thumb, hesitating. What if it was a prank? Or worse, what if it was serious? What could someone like her possibly want from someone like him? Jake, a voice snapped him back to reality. He looked up to find Mr. Grayson standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression as unreadable as ever. Jake straightened immediately, stuffing the card into his pocket. "Office, Mr." Grayson said curtly, before turning on his heel and disappearing down the hall. Jake's stomach sank. He followed reluctantly, his steps slow, each one echoing like a drumbeat. By the time he reached the office, Mr. Grayson was already seated behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he watched Jake enter. "Sit," he ordered. Jake complied, perching on the edge of the chair like a guilty schoolboy waiting for detention. He braced himself for the inevitable lecture, the one where Mr. Grayson would tell him he wasn't cut out for this job, that his mistakes were unacceptable, and that he should probably start looking for work elsewhere. Instead, Mr. Grayson leaned back in his chair, regarding Jake with a calculating expression. "What happened last night?" Mr. Grayson began. His tone measured, was unacceptable. "I know, sir," Jake said quickly. "It won't happen again." "Quiet," Mr. Grayson interrupted. "I'm not finished." Jake swallowed hard, nodding. "Eleanor Prescott is one of our most important patrons," Mr. Grayson continued. "She has connections that could make or break this establishment. Do you understand the gravity of that?" "Yes, sir," Jake mumbled. "And yet," Mr. Grayson said, his eyes narrowing, "she specifically requested you remain her server for the remainder of the evening." Jake blinked, caught off guard. "She, what?" "You heard me," Mr. Grayson said, his tone clipped. "She spoke highly of you, despite your clumsiness." Jake sat back in his chair, dumbfounded. Of all the possible outcomes, this was the last thing he had expected. He had spent the entire evening dreading Mr. Grayson's wrath, only to discover that Eleanor had somehow smoothed things over for him. "Consider yourself lucky," Mr. Grayson said, leaning forward. "You're not fired. Yet. But if you ever embarrass this restaurant again—" "I won't," Jake blurted out, his voice shaking. "I promise." Mr. Grayson gave a curt nod. "Good. Now get back to work." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from the office, his heart pounding. As he returned to the floor, his mind reeled. Eleanor Prescott hadn't just saved him from being fired. She had gone out of her way to protect him. Why? Later that night, as Jake finished his shift and walked home under the orange glow of the streetlights, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just shifted in some intangible way. Eleanor's words, her calm, confident demeanor, lingered in his mind. And then there was the card. The way she had handed it to him, as if it were a lifeline. Back in his apartment, Jake sat at his small, rickety table, turning the card over in his hands. His phone sat next to it, the screen dark, waiting. He took a deep breath, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Finally, he picked up the phone and dialed the number printed in gold. It rang twice before a voice answered, a smooth, professional tone that immediately made Jake feel out of place. "Prescott Foundation. How may I direct your call?" Jake hesitated, his throat suddenly dry. I'm looking for Eleanor Prescott." "One moment, please." The line clicked, and Jake's heart raced. He nearly hung up, panic rising. But then her voice came through, warm and unmistakable. "Jake," she said, as if she had been expecting him. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't call." He swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure if I should." "Well," she said, a smile evident in her tone, "I'm glad you did. Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" Jake blinked, taken aback. "Tomorrow? I have a proposition for you," Eleanor said, "but I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Let's meet at my office. 2 o'clock. Sure," Jake stammered, unsure what else to say. "Excellent," Eleanor said. "I'll send you the address." "And Jake?" "Yeah. Don't be nervous." The line went dead, leaving Jake staring at his phone, his mind spinning. He set the phone down carefully, staring at the Prescott Foundation card once more. Tomorrow, he would find out what Eleanor Prescott wanted from him. Whatever it was, Jake had a feeling his life was about to change. The office of the Prescott Foundation was nothing like Jake had imagined. He had pictured something sleek and intimidating. Marble floors, steel accents, and the kind of sterile minimalism that screamed wealth. Instead, he found himself in a space that felt welcoming. The warm glow of natural light filtered through tall windows, illuminating walls lined with books and photographs. Comfortable leather chairs surrounded a coffee table scattered with magazines, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. Jake fidgeted near the entrance, feeling out of place in his neatly pressed but clearly inexpensive clothes. He had spent the morning wrestling with his wardrobe, trying to find something that looked presentable but didn't feel like a lie. Now, standing in the heart of Eleanor Prescott's world, he wondered if he had made the right choice calling her. "Jake Miller," a voice said behind him. He turned quickly to see Eleanor herself approaching, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She was as composed as ever, her auburn hair swept into a neat twist, her tailored blouse and pencil skirt exuding effortless sophistication. But it wasn't her clothes that struck him. It was the warmth in her smile, the way her eyes softened when they met his. "You came," she said, her tone as easy as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. Jake nodded awkwardly. "Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should." "I'm glad you did," she said, motioning for him to follow her. "Come on, let's talk." She led him down a hallway to a private office, its decor as inviting as the rest of the building. A large wooden desk sat at the center, flanked by plush chairs and a sofa. Eleanor gestured for Jake to take a seat in one of the chairs while she moved behind the desk, her movements measured but relaxed. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, her fingers brushing over a sleek machine on the desk's edge. Jake shook his head. "No, thank you." Eleanor poured herself a cup, then leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "I imagine you have questions," she said finally. Jake let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, I guess you could say that." "Well, let's start with the simple one," she said, her tone light. "Why did I give you my card?" "That's definitely one of them," Jake admitted. Eleanor smiled faintly, taking a sip of her coffee before setting the cup down. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she said. "Someone who needed a little help finding his way." Jake frowned, unsure what to make of that. "You mean, like, charity?" "No," Eleanor said firmly, her smile fading. "Not charity. Opportunity." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jake shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. "Jake," Eleanor continued, her tone softening, "I see potential in you. The way you handled yourself at the restaurant, even under pressure, it showed resilience. You made a mistake, but you didn't crumble. That's something not everyone can do." Jake stared at her, bewildered. "I spilled a drink on you, and you recovered," she countered. "More importantly, you treated me like a person, not just a customer. Do you know how rare that is?" Jake hesitated, his thoughts racing. He didn't feel resilient. He felt like a mess, barely holding himself together most days. But the way Eleanor spoke, like she saw something in him he couldn't see in himself, left him speechless. "I run the Prescott Foundation," Eleanor went on, gesturing around her office. "Our goal is to empower individuals who have potential but lack opportunity. People like you." "People like me?" Jake repeated, his voice tinged with skepticism. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eleanor's expression didn't falter. "It means people who work hard but are stuck in circumstances that don't allow them to grow. People who are underestimated." Jake looked down at his hands, her words cutting deeper than he expected. She wasn't wrong. His entire life had been a series of uphill battles, each one leaving him more exhausted than the last. But the idea that someone had noticed, that someone believed he was capable of more, felt almost too good to be true. "What are you offering?" he asked cautiously. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "A chance to work with the foundation. We're planning an event, a charity gala to raise funds for educational programs. I need someone who can help organize the logistics." Jake blinked, stunned. "You want me to organize a gala?" "Not alone," Eleanor said with a small smile. "You'd have guidance. But yes, I think you'd be a valuable addition to the team." Jake's heart raced. He barely knew anything about event planning, let alone for something as grand as a gala. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's smile softened. "Because I believe in giving people chances, Jake. And I think you deserve one." The days that followed were a whirlwind of unfamiliar tasks and new challenges. Jake found himself thrust into a world of conference calls, catering contracts, and guest lists. Eleanor's team was small but efficient, and they quickly took him under their wing, teaching him the ropes with patience and encouragement. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The work was demanding, but it was rewarding in a way he hadn't expected. He learned to navigate spreadsheets, coordinate with vendors, and even negotiate with sponsors. And through it all, Eleanor remained a steady presence, offering advice and support when he needed it most. One evening, as they wrapped up a long day of preparations, Eleanor invited Jake to join her for a cup of tea in her office. He hesitated at first, unsure if it was appropriate, but she waved off his concerns with a laugh. "You've earned it," she said, handing him a steaming cup. Jake sank into one of the chairs, the warmth of the tea soothing after hours on his feet. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the hum of the city outside their window the only sound. "Why do you do this?" Jake asked finally, breaking the quiet. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Because someone once did it for me." Jake looked at her, surprised. "You mean, you weren't always this?" she finished, gesturing around her office. "No, I wasn't. I grew up in a very different world, Jake. One where opportunities were few and far between." Jake leaned forward, curious. "What changed?" Eleanor smiled, a hint of nostalgia in her eyes. "Someone saw potential in me. They gave me a chance, and I made the most of it. That's why I started the foundation, to pay it forward." Her words resonated deeply with Jake. He had always assumed people like Eleanor lived in a separate world, one he could never touch. But hearing her story made him realize that maybe their worlds weren't so different after all. As he left the office that night, Jake felt a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years. Maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe this was his chance to change his life. Jake hadn't fully grasped how much his life had changed until he found himself standing in front of the Prescott Foundation's conference room, holding a clipboard with notes about catering options. The room buzzed with activity, team members discussing decorations, seating arrangements, and auction items for the upcoming gala. Jake, still getting used to the pace of it all, took a deep breath and stepped inside. The chatter died down when Eleanor entered the room, her presence commanding but unpretentious. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored navy slacks, she exuded an air of effortless authority. She glanced around the room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, before smiling warmly at Jake. "Jake, why don't you brief everyone on the progress with the vendors?" she said, gesturing for him to take the floor. Jake froze for a split second, the weight of her request settling on his shoulders. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not in a room full of professionals who clearly knew more about event planning than he did. But then he remembered Eleanor's words from the other day, "You don't need to know everything, you just need to try." Clearing his throat, Jake stepped forward and adjusted the clipboard in his hands. The catering team confirmed the menu yesterday," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "We're finalizing the tasting schedule, and they've agreed to accommodate any dietary restrictions we send over by Friday." The team nodded approvingly, and Eleanor gave him an encouraging smile. Jake felt a surge of relief. Maybe he was getting the hang of this after all. After the meeting, Eleanor invited Jake to her office. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over the room. Eleanor motioned for Jake to sit, pouring herself a glass of water as she leaned against the edge of her desk. "You're doing well, Jake," she said, her tone genuine. "The team appreciates your input, and I can see you're starting to find your rhythm." Jake shifted in his seat, still adjusting to her compliments. "Thanks. I'm just trying to keep up." Eleanor smiled. "You're doing more than keeping up. But there's something else I wanted to discuss with you." Jake's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Eleanor set her glass down and crossed her arms, her expression softening. "I've been thinking about what's next for you, beyond this gala. I know this isn't your career path, but I see potential in you. Potential that I think could be developed further." Jake blinked, unsure of where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I'd like to sponsor your education," she said finally. "If you're interested, the foundation can cover the cost for you to attend classes or a program of your choice. Something that aligns with your goals." Jake stared at her, his mind racing. You want to pay for my education?" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I believe in investing in people, Jake, and I think this could be a turning point for you." Jake's first instinct was to decline. It was too much, too generous, too overwhelming. He had spent his entire life scraping by, relying on his own efforts to survive. The idea of someone stepping in to help, let alone offering something as life-changing as an education, felt almost impossible to accept. "I don't know," he said hesitantly, looking down at his hands. "It just feels like a lot." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "I understand how it might feel that way, but think about what this could mean for your future. You've already proven you're capable of stepping out of your comfort zone. This is just the next step." Jake looked up at her, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why are you doing this for me?" Eleanor's expression softened. "Because someone did it for me," she said. "And because I believe in you, even if you don't believe in yourself yet." Her words struck a chord deep within Jake, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility. What if he said yes? What if he took this chance and turned it into something more? The idea was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her smile warm. "That's all I ask." That night, Jake lay awake in his tiny apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling as Eleanor's proposal echoed in his mind. The thought of going back to school, of pursuing something he truly cared about, felt like a dream he hadn't allowed himself to have in years. But the doubts crept in, too. What if he failed? What if he wasn't good enough? He thought about his mom, the sacrifices she had made to keep their lives afloat. Could he really justify stepping away from his job to chase something so uncertain? Or was this exactly the kind of opportunity he owed it to her, and himself, to take? The questions swirled in his mind as he drifted off to sleep, the faint glimmer of hope battling the weight of his fears. The next morning, Jake arrived at the foundation early, determined to throw himself into his work and push the decision aside for now. But Eleanor, ever perceptive, caught him in the hallway. "Jake," she said, her voice gentle, "have you given it any more thought?" Jake hesitated, glancing down at the papers in his hands. "I have," he admitted. "And I don't know. It's a big decision." "It is," Eleanor agreed, her gaze steady. "But big decisions are the ones that shape our lives. And you don't have to make it alone." Jake met her eyes, the weight of her words settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like someone was truly in his corner. Not because they wanted something from him, but because they genuinely believed in him. "I'll do it," he said finally, the words tumbling out before he could overthink them. Eleanor's smile was radiant, her pride evident. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "We'll take it one step at a time, Jake. You're going to do great." As she walked away, Jake felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. The Prescott Foundation's gala was just 2 weeks away, and the pressure in the office was palpable. Every detail, from the lighting arrangements to the guest list, had to be perfect. For Jake, the pace was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His days were filled with endless calls, meetings, and emails, while his nights blurred into spreadsheets and notes scrawled on the back of takeout menus. Yet, despite the exhaustion, there was a strange satisfaction in it all, a sense that he was part of something significant. But satisfaction didn't erase the challenges. If anything, they seemed to multiply as the days ticked by. Jake was juggling more responsibilities than ever, and the learning curve felt impossibly steep. He had grown comfortable serving tables and blending into the background at La Seraphine. Now, he was in the spotlight, expected to deliver results. Eleanor's faith in him was unwavering, but Jake often wondered if she had misjudged him. He didn't have her polish or confidence. Every time he entered a room, he felt like an imposter, trying to play a role he wasn't meant for. The breaking point came on a Monday morning during a team briefing. The catering manager had emailed Jake to confirm the delivery schedule, but Jake had misread the message. He realized too late that the kitchen staff expected access to the venue a day earlier than planned. As Eleanor's assistant outlined the day's agenda, Jake sat frozen, his heart pounding as the implications of his mistake sank in. When the meeting ended, he approached Eleanor, his voice hesitant. "I need to talk to you." She looked up from her notes, her expression attentive. "What's on your mind?" Jake hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The caterers need access to the venue a day earlier than I told the team." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "How much of a problem is this?" "It could push the setup back," Jake said, his chest tightening. "I don't know if we can adjust everything in time." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "All right," she said calmly. "Let's figure it out. Who do we need to call?" Jake blinked, caught off guard by her lack of reprimand. "You're not mad?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. "Jake, mistakes happen. What matters is how you handle them. Now, let's fix this." Her calm confidence steadied him, and together they mapped out a plan to adjust the schedule. By the end of the day, the crisis was averted, and Jake felt a wave of relief. But the experience left him shaken. How many more mistakes could he afford to make before Eleanor's patience ran out? That evening, Jake stayed late at the office, determined to prove himself. The building was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the soft tapping of his keyboard. He was reviewing vendor contracts when he heard a knock at the door. He looked up to find Eleanor standing there, a cup of coffee in her hand. "You're still here," she said, stepping inside. Jake shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I wanted to make sure everything's ready for tomorrow." Eleanor set the coffee on the desk and took a seat across from him. "Jake," she said gently, "you don't have to kill yourself trying to be perfect. I just don't want to let you down," Jake admitted, his voice tight. "You're not," Eleanor said firmly, "but you can't do everything on your own. That's why we have a team." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just feel like I'm in over my head, like I'm pretending to know what I'm doing, and any second, everyone's going to figure out I don't belong here." Eleanor's expression softened. "Do you know how many times I've felt the same way?" Jake looked at her, surprised. "You?" "Of course," she said with a laugh. "When I first started the foundation, I had no idea what I was doing. There were days I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But I learned something important. Confidence doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from trusting yourself to figure it out." Her words lingered in the quiet room, and for the first time, Jake allowed himself to believe she might be right. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but he was learning, and that had to count for something. As the days passed, Jake began to find his footing. He leaned on the team more, asking questions and seeking advice when he needed it. The work was still overwhelming, but he started to see progress. Decorations finalized, guest lists confirmed, auction items secured. Each small victory built his confidence, piece by piece. One afternoon, as Jake reviewed seating arrangements with one of the coordinators, Eleanor walked by and paused. "Good work, Jake," she said, her voice warm. "Keep it up." Her words, simple as they were, filled Jake with a pride he hadn't felt in years. He still had doubts about his abilities, about his place here, but he was starting to believe he might be capable of more than he'd thought. The day before the gala, The team gathered in the venue's ballroom for a final walkthrough. The space was breathtaking, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off the polished floors and the elegantly draped tables. As Jake stood at the back of the room, watching the preparations unfold, Eleanor joined him. "Looks good, doesn't it?" she said. Jake nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. "Yeah, it does." Eleanor glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Jake. I hope you see that." Jake smiled faintly, his gaze still on the room. "I'm getting there." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice quiet but firm. "You're not just getting there. You're making it happen. And tomorrow, when this place is filled with people, I want you to remember something. You earned this." Jake swallowed hard, her words settling deep within him. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The evening of the gala arrived with an electric energy that pulsed through the city streets. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos began trickling into the venue, their laughter and chatter filling the grand hall. Jake stood at the edge of the ballroom, his clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. The transformation of the space was breathtaking. Golden light spilled from the chandeliers, reflecting off crystal glasses and perfectly set tables. Months of planning had culminated in this moment. Yet, Jake's nerves were at an all-time high. His neatly pressed suit felt too stiff, his polished shoes pinching his feet. He scanned the room, mentally running through every detail: catering, music, auction items. He had triple-checked everything, but the lingering fear of something going wrong gnawed at him. "Relax," Eleanor said, appearing beside him with her trademark calm. She was radiant in an emerald gown, her presence commanding yet approachable. "You've done everything you needed to do. Now, enjoy the night." Jake gave a nervous laugh. "I don't think I know how to enjoy something like this." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. "Then consider tonight your first lesson." Before he could respond, she stepped away, greeting a cluster of donors near the bar. Jake watched her, marveling at how effortlessly she moved through the crowd. She made it look easy, as if this world was where she belonged. And yet, he remembered her words, how she, too, had once felt out of place. That thought steadied him. As the evening unfolded, Jake's confidence began to grow. The catering ran smoothly, the band struck the perfect balance between lively and elegant, and the auction drew eager bids. Every time a small hiccup arose, a delayed tray of hors d'oeuvres, a misplaced name card, Jake found himself stepping in, handling it with a calm he hadn't known he possessed. It wasn't until halfway through the evening, when he stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, that Jake allowed himself to reflect. He leaned against the stone railing of the balcony, gazing out at the city skyline. The night air was cool, a welcome reprieve from the bustling ballroom. "You're doing well, you know," came a voice from behind him. Jake turned to find Eleanor approaching, a glass of champagne in her hand. She joined him at the railing, her gaze following his out over the city. "I don't know about that," Jake said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I still feel like I'm one mistake away from ruining everything." Eleanor laughed softly. "Jake, let me tell you something I've learned over the years. The people who worry about making mistakes are usually the ones who care enough to avoid them. And even if you do stumble, it's how you recover that matters." Jake nodded, her words resonating. "It's just hard to believe I'm here, that I'm part of this." Eleanor turned to him, her expression warm. "You're not just part of it. You've made it happen. Look at that room," she said, gesturing toward the glowing ballroom visible through the tall windows. "That's your work, Jake. Your determination. Don't downplay that." Jake followed her gaze, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and disbelief. He thought about where he had been just months ago, fumbling trays at La Seraphine, struggling to make ends meet. And now, here he was, standing beside Eleanor Prescott, overseeing a gala that would raise funds to change lives. The realization hit him like a wave. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Eleanor smiled, her eyes kind. "You've earned it, Jake. And this is just the beginning." Later that evening, as the final speeches wrapped up and the crowd began to thin, Jake found himself pulled aside by one of the gala's major donors, a silver-haired man with a sharp suit and a sharper gaze. "You're Jake, right?" the man asked, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Jake shook his hand, his surprise evident. Yes, sir. I'm Jake. I just wanted to say," the man continued, "this event has been exceptional. Eleanor's told me how much work you put into it, and it shows. If you're ever looking for more opportunities, let me know. My company could use someone with your drive." Jake blinked, taken aback. Thank you. That means a lot." As the man disappeared into the crowd, Jake stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just Eleanor who believed in him anymore. People were starting to notice him, for his work, for his potential. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. By the end of the night, the ballroom was quiet, the tables cleared and the chandeliers dimmed. The team lingered, exchanging tired smiles and congratulations. Jake found Eleanor near the stage, overseeing the breakdown of the auction items. "It's done," Jake said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It is," Eleanor agreed, turning to face him. "And it was a success." Jake smiled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "I couldn't have done it without you." Eleanor shook her head. "You give me too much credit. All I did was open the door. You walked through it." Jake looked at her, his gratitude overwhelming. "I don't think I can ever repay you for what you've done." Eleanor's smile was soft. "You don't need to repay me, Jake. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Jake said without hesitation. "When the time comes, and you see someone else struggling to find their way, do for them what I've done for you. Pay it forward." Jake nodded, her words settling deep within him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the nervous waiter spilling drinks at La Seraphine. He was something more. And for the first time, he believed in the possibility of a brighter future, not just for himself, but for those he might one day help. The morning after the gala, Jake woke up to sunlight streaming through his apartment window, a rare sense of calm settling over him. The night before had been a whirlwind, an experience he would never forget. The gala had been a resounding success, raising more funds than anyone had anticipated. Even now, Jake couldn't fully process how far he had come in such a short time. But as he sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the questions he had buried in the chaos of the event began to resurface. Eleanor Prescott. Who was she, really? She had taken an interest in him, supported him, and offered him opportunities he never thought possible. But her kindness wasn't random. There had to be more to her story, more to her reasons for choosing him. And Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were closer than he realized. When Jake arrived at the Prescott Foundation later that morning, the office was quieter than usual. The team was taking the day to recover, but Eleanor had asked Jake to stop by for a debrief. He knocked lightly on her office door before stepping inside. Eleanor was seated at her desk, reviewing a stack of documents. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm but tired. "Jake," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I wasn't sure you'd make it in today. I figured I'd stop by," Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. "You wanted to talk?" Eleanor nodded, setting the papers aside. "I wanted to thank you again for your work last night. The gala was a huge success, and it wouldn't have been possible without you." Jake shifted in his seat, her praise still feeling surreal. "It was a team effort," he said modestly. "True," Eleanor agreed, her smile softening. "But you were the heart of it." There was a pause, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Jake hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, her gaze steady. "Why me?" Jake asked, his voice quieter now. "Out of all the people you could have chosen to help, why did you pick me?" "It's not like I'm special or anything." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. For a moment, Jake thought she might dodge the question, but then she spoke. "Jake," she began, her tone gentle, "you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who was struggling to find their way, just like you." Jake frowned slightly. "Who?" Eleanor hesitated, then reached into a drawer, pulling out a worn photograph. She handed it to Jake, who stared at the image of a young man standing in front of a modest house, his expression both determined and uncertain. "That's my brother," Eleanor said quietly. "His name was Michael." Jake looked up at her, confusion etched on his face. "I didn't know you had a brother." Eleanor's smile was bittersweet. "I don't talk about him often. He passed away years ago." Jake felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Michael was a lot like you. He was hardworking, kind, and always looking for a way to make something of himself. But life wasn't easy for him. Our family struggled, and he had to fight for every opportunity." Jake studied the photograph again, the resemblance striking. "What happened to him?" Eleanor's gaze grew distant. "He got a job at a high-end restaurant, much like you. He worked tirelessly, trying to save up for school. But one night, a mistake cost him his job. He spilled wine on a customer, a wealthy woman who didn't have the grace to let it slide." Jake's breath caught in his throat. The story felt eerily familiar. "That incident shattered his confidence," Eleanor continued. "He thought he'd lost his chance to prove himself, but someone saw potential in him. A mentor. They gave him a second chance, helped him find his footing, and he built a life he could be proud of." Jake looked at her, realization dawning. "And you saw that same potential in me?" Eleanor nodded, her expression warm. "I saw the same determination, the same resilience. And I wanted to be for you what that mentor was for Michael." Jake felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Eleanor said softly. "Just know that I believe in you, Jake. And I hope you'll believe in yourself." As Jake left Eleanor's office, the weight of her story settled over him. For the first time, he understood why she had taken a chance on him. It wasn't just about him. It was about honoring her brother's memory, about paying forward the kindness that had changed his life. And in that moment, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude. Later that night, as he sat in his apartment, Jake pulled out his phone and stared at the contact list. His mother's name was near the top, and he hesitated before pressing the call button. When she answered, her voice was warm, filled with the same quiet strength that had carried them through so many hard times. "Jake," she said, surprised. "It's late. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Jake said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me." There was a pause, and then his mother's voice softened. "You're welcome, honey. But what brought this on?" Jake smiled faintly. "I guess I'm starting to see things a little differently." They talked for a while longer, and when the call ended, Jake felt lighter. Eleanor's belief in him, combined with his mother's unwavering support, had given him a clarity he hadn't had before. He wasn't just working to prove himself anymore. He was working to honor the people who believed in him and to become someone others could rely on. The weeks following the gala marked a new chapter in Jake's life. The transformation was subtle at first, like a seed taking root beneath the soil. But as the days turned into weeks, it became impossible to ignore. Jake was no longer just scraping by. He was thriving. And yet, the weight of what this meant to himself, to the people who believed in him, sat heavy on his shoulders. At the Prescott Foundation, the ripple effects of the gala's success were undeniable. Jake had proven himself to the team, not just as a capable worker, but as a leader who could adapt under pressure. His name now carried weight in conversations, a far cry from the anonymous figure who had once stumbled through the halls of La Seraphine. It was a reality that filled him with pride, but also a quiet sense of disbelief. It was a brisk Wednesday morning when Eleanor called Jake into her office for their usual debrief. The room, with its familiar warmth and understated elegance, had become a kind of refuge for Jake, an unlikely place where he had discovered not just opportunity, but a version of himself he hadn't known existed. Eleanor sat behind her desk, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She motioned for Jake to take a seat, her smile as welcoming as ever. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice light but genuine. Jake shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Better than I thought I would. Still trying to process everything." Eleanor nodded knowingly. "That's to be expected. Big changes take time to settle in." They spent the next few minutes reviewing the follow-up tasks from the gala, thank you notes for donors, updates on the new education initiatives funded by the event, and plans for upcoming campaigns. Jake felt the familiar rush of satisfaction as they ticked items off the list, each one a reminder of what they had accomplished together. But as the conversation wound down, Eleanor's tone shifted. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Jake, I wanted to talk to you about what's next." Jake blinked, caught off guard. "Next?" Eleanor nodded. "You've made an incredible impact here, but I think it's time to start thinking about your long-term goals. Where do you see yourself going from here?" Jake hesitated, the question settling heavily in the air between them. He had spent so much of his life focused on surviving the present that he'd never truly considered the future. And now, faced with the opportunity to dream bigger, he found himself at a loss. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I mean, I've learned so much here, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." Eleanor's smile softened. "That's okay, Jake. You don't need to have all the answers right now. But I want you to know that whatever path you choose, the foundation will support you. This is just the beginning." Jake nodded slowly, her words both comforting and daunting. "I'll think about it," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he felt a spark of something. Hope, maybe, or the faint outline of a dream. Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into his work, but Eleanor's question lingered in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had changed. He wasn't the nervous waiter at La Seraphine anymore, nor was he the unsure assistant fumbling through spreadsheets at the foundation. He had grown into someone who could handle challenges, who could lead, who could make a difference. That realization hit him one afternoon when he was mentoring a group of interns. They had been discussing strategies for an upcoming campaign, and Jake had been walking them through the details. One of the interns, a shy young woman named Mia, hesitated before raising her hand. "Jake," she said, her voice barely audible, "how did you get started here? I mean, how did you end up doing what you do?" Jake paused, the question catching him off guard. He thought about the night at La Seraphine, the spilled drink, Eleanor's calm reaction. He thought about the card she had given him, the leap of faith he had taken when he called her. And he thought about the many times he had doubted himself, only to find strength he hadn't known he had. "It wasn't planned," he said finally, his voice steady. "I made a mistake, a pretty big one, and someone saw potential in me anyway. That chance changed everything." Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever feel like you're not good enough for all this?" Jake smiled faintly, the weight of her words hitting close to home. "All the time. But I've learned that it's not about being perfect. It's about trying. And when you mess up, you learn and keep going." The group nodded, their faces bright with a mixture of hope and determination. Jake felt a swell of pride, not just in them, but in himself. For the first time, he realized that he was becoming the kind of mentor Eleanor had been for him. Months later, Jake found himself standing in the kitchen of his mother's small apartment. She was chopping vegetables for dinner, her movements steady and deliberate. Jake leaned against the counter, watching her, the smell of home-cooked food filling the air. "You seem different," his mother said suddenly, glancing up at him. Jake chuckled. "Different how?" "More sure of yourself," she said, her gaze softening. "Like you found your place." Jake smiled, the truth of her words settling over him. "I think I have." His mother set the knife down and turned to face him fully. "I'm proud of you, Jake. You've come a long way." Jake felt his throat tighten, her words cutting through him in the best way. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." They talked for hours that night, Jake sharing stories about the foundation, the gala, and the plans he was starting to make for the future. It felt good to open up, to let her see how much he had grown. One evening, as Jake stood in his apartment staring out the window, he thought about Eleanor's advice, to think about what he truly wanted. For so long, he had measured success by survival. But now, he realized, success meant more than that. It meant building something lasting, not just for himself, but for others. Pulling out his laptop, Jake began drafting a proposal for a new initiative at the foundation, one focused on helping young people transition from survival jobs to meaningful careers. The idea wasn't fully formed yet, but it felt right. And for the first time, Jake felt ready to chase it. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Jake smiled to himself. His journey was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the person he used to be. He had grown into someone stronger, someone capable of making a difference, and he couldn't wait to see where the road would take him next. The Prescott Foundation was buzzing with life. Since the gala, new initiatives had sprung up, each one carrying the promise of change. But something was different about the energy in the office. It was more personal, more driven, and Jake, now a cornerstone of the team, had become the heart of that momentum. On a bright Monday morning, Jake stood at the head of a conference room table, presenting his newest project proposal. The room was filled with team members, donors, and even Eleanor herself, who watched him with quiet pride. The initiative he was pitching, designed to help young people transition from dead-end jobs to meaningful careers, had grown from a seed of an idea into a fully realized plan. And with these partnerships, Jake said, gesturing to a chart on the screen, we can provide mentorship opportunities, vocational training, and career counseling. The goal is simple: to give people the tools they need to succeed, no matter where they're starting from. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Jake felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him as Eleanor stood to address the group. This, she said, gesturing toward Jake, is exactly what the Prescott Foundation is about. Giving people a chance to change their lives, and then watching them inspire others to do the same. Jake's chest tightened at her words. He had spent so much of his life feeling invisible, but now, he was standing in a room full of people who believed in him. It was a feeling he would never take for granted. Over the weeks that followed, Jake's initiative began to take shape. He spent his days meeting with local businesses, schools, and community organizations, building the network that would bring his vision to life. His nights were often spent at his desk, poring over budgets and schedules, but he didn't mind the long hours. For the first time, his work felt like a calling. One afternoon, as Jake was finalizing details for a pilot program, Eleanor stopped by his office. She leaned against the doorframe, her expression warm. "You're doing great work, Jake," she said. "Thanks," Jake replied, looking up from his screen. "But it's still a lot to figure out." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "That's how you know it's worth it." She stepped into the room, her tone shifting to something more reflective. "You know," she said, "when I first started the foundation, I thought success would be measured by numbers. Funds raised, people helped, events hosted. But it's not just about that. It's about the ripple effect. The way one act of kindness can inspire another, and another." Jake nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I get it now," he said. "It's not just about what we do. It's about what it leads to." Eleanor's smile widened. "Exactly." Months later, Jake stood in the crowded auditorium of a local community center. The first cohort of his pilot program was about to graduate, and the room was filled with their families, friends, and mentors. As the graduates walked across the stage to receive their certificates, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of pride. One of the graduates, a young man named David, paused to shake Jake's hand. "Thank you," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "You changed my life." Jake shook his head, his throat tight. "You did the work, David. I just helped you get started." The ceremony ended with a standing ovation, and as Jake looked out at the crowd, he realized how much his own life had changed since that fateful night at La Seraphine. The nervous waiter who had once spilled a drink on a wealthy customer was now standing on a stage, helping others find their way. Back at the Prescott Foundation, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about Eleanor, about her brother Michael, and about the countless moments that had shaped his path. Each one felt like a stepping stone, leading him to this point. Eleanor knocked on his office door, pulling him from his thoughts. "Got a minute?" she asked. Jake nodded, gesturing for her to come in. She sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "You've become more than just a part of the foundation, Jake. You've become part of its legacy." Jake frowned slightly, unsure what she meant. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's smile was soft but steady. "The work you're doing, the lives you're changing, it's bigger than any single event or program. It's creating something that will last long after we're gone." Jake's chest tightened, her words carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said. Eleanor shook her head. You give me too much credit. All I did was open the door. You chose to walk through it, and look at how far you've come." Jake smiled, her words filling him with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "Thank you," he said simply. Eleanor rose, her gaze steady. "Don't thank me. Just keep doing the work." As the months turned into years, Jake's initiative grew beyond what he had imagined. The program expanded to new cities, touching the lives of hundreds of young people. Each success story was a reminder of the power of second chances, and Jake carried that lesson with him every day. One evening, as Jake walked home under the glow of the streetlights, he thought about the journey he had taken. He thought about the nervous waiter who had once doubted his worth, about the woman who had seen potential in him when no one else had, and about the people who had become part of his life along the way. The ripple effect Eleanor had spoken of was real, and Jake was living proof of it. But more importantly, he was part of it now, passing on the kindness and belief that had changed his life. As he turned the corner to his apartment, Jake smiled to himself. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt ready for whatever came next. Because now, he knew. Every small act of courage, every choice to keep going, had the power to create something extraordinary.